Okay. This interview is part of the History Heard project. The content of this interview may be used for historical research. However, no part of the video itself may be reproduced without the express written permission of an authorized representative of History Heard. Today is June 25th, 2009 at 11 a.m. This is an interview with Robert Kahn in Washington, D.C. He was born on December 23rd, 1938 in Brooklyn, New York. So, when we were doing some research, we remembered that there were physicists that thought of the M theory when they were on a train to go see Copenhagen, I think, the play. And so it was a huge theory that they came up with, but then when asked what they did afterwards, they said, we went to the play. So when you and Dr. Cerf started thinking about the internet, then do you remember that moment, or do you remember what you did?
Well, I remember my version of it. History is a little vague on this, other people's part. I believe that the first discussion I ever had with Ben Cerf about working on the internet was at an electronics meeting at the Statler Hilton Hotel, which at that point was on something like 7th Avenue and 33rd Street, right opposite Madison Square Garden, or thereabouts. And I discussed with him a project that I had been thinking about, but I needed somebody to work with me on it that had practical experience in dealing with the computers, because I was a communications engineer and had been working on the networking side. And he and I got real interested, thought about it, and we agreed to then meet. We had a subsequent meeting either in Washington, D.C., where my offices were at the time, or at Stanford, or vice versa, and we kept going back and forth. We probably had about 6, 8, 10 meetings on the subject, during which time we worked out the basics of the protocols for the internet.
Right. And there must have been times when you just thought about, like, what it would become, an ARPANET, obviously you thought about what it would become, but, like, did you ever just, like, think as huge as it is now? Like, did you think that?
Well, you have to distinguish ARPANET and internet.
Right.
The internet was all about protocols and procedures for allowing arbitrary networks to work together.
Right.
So it wasn't about any particular network. In fact, one of the issues that I have today when people talk about the internet, they talk about it as if it's another network.
Right.
When in fact, what it is the result of federating together a lot of different networks, and what we created were the protocols and procedures that allowed that to happen. So it's not like one network connects them all, it's the protocols and procedures that, if used, will allow that to happen. The ARPANET was a very specific network, like an Ethernet is a very specific network. It happened to be the very first packet switch network that was ever developed, and so it demonstrated a completely different way of doing communications, but practically speaking, it was just one more network. And so when we were working on the ARPANET itself, I had just taken a leave of absence from MIT up in the Boston area, and I was at a little company that mainly was working on architectural acoustics called Bolt, Beranek and Newman. And most people didn't think computer networking was a very valuable thing to work on. In fact, most people told me I was throwing my career away, simply because back in those days there were no personal computers. The only machines you had were these very large machines, mainly run by universities and some big companies. They didn't exchange jobs. I mean, if you brought a computer job to your local comp center at your university, they weren't thinking, gee, how can I ship this job off somewhere else? They wanted the business themselves.
Right.
So it didn't seem like there was very much need for this sort of thing. I just found it an interesting problem and started to work on it. And fortunately, there were people in the U.S. government at an organization in the Defense Department called ARPA at the time. Later, they put a D in front for defense, called it DARPA, that thought this would be useful to connect some of their research centers where they were just acquiring some time-sharing machines, and that this would allow them to interact and they could share computer programs and other resources. And so they put in an RFQ, a request for quotations, on actually building such a net. I happened to be at BBN at the time and wrote the technical part of the proposal that won the contract for us, and we ended up building it. I ended up, as a result, going down to DARPA, ended up running the office.
Great. And are there any moments throughout the whole process that stand out to you as funny or memorable or anything?
Well, I mean, the whole process was pretty memorable
Well, yeah, that's true.
because we were, I mean, we knew that this was really interesting.
Yeah.
But we weren't thinking of it from the point of view of kind of business investment. I mean, we were researchers back then.
Right.
I was, a kid, my 20s. And we found it, just really interesting to work on. And there really weren't any big surprises along the way until later when people suddenly discovered it and it, hit the TV sets and the press. I mean, Vit and I actually were given custodianship of an award that one of the major publications, I think it was InfoWorld, gave out in 1993 or so, basically for the product of the year, which was, guess what?
Yeah.
The internet.
Yeah.
Well, it had been around for some 20 years by then in terms of function
Didn't know
and
about it.
capability. It just had gotten into the public awareness at that point.
Right. Were there ever times when you thought about just giving up? It was frustrating or anything?
No, I mean, it was, in terms of the work itself, I would say no. It's sort of like, being tossed into a raging rapid. And saying, at any time did you ever think about just getting out of the canoe? And, I mean, you almost didn't have a chance. There were times during the process when it became very clear that this was so interesting that so many people were vying for it, and this one wanted credit and that one wanted credit, that I was saying, let me just go do something else for a while. And I actually tried to do that in the 1972 timeframe, when I was thinking about actually working on a project in automated manufacturing, an instrumented camera, factory, and all of the workmanship, and just sort of automatically make things. But no, the Congress never put up the money, and I went back into networking. That's in fact when I got into the internet.